The alarms tore through the corridor before I even finished lacing my boots, and I ran toward the noise instead of away from it, because nobody had told me yet that running toward the noise was the wrong instinct to have on my very first week aboard a warship. Red light washed over the walls. A voice on the intercom said the hull had been breached on Deck 4, and that every soul not assigned to a station should get to a shelter pod immediately. I did not know where the shelter pods were. I did not know where Deck 4 was either, but my legs carried me down a ladder shaft anyway, following the sound of metal groaning somewhere below. That is how I ended up standing in a smoke-filled corridor, alone, 19 years old, holding a fire extinguisher like it was a weapon, when the deadliest woman in the fleet stepped out of the smoke in front of me. I knew who she was the second I saw her eyes. Everyone on the ship had described them the same way, pale gold, narrow, unblinking, like a predator that had never once needed to hurry. Her name was Vesa Ilan, and the crew called her the Widow of the Long War, though never to her face. She was not human. She belonged to a species called the Drayeth, tall and lean, with skin the color of riverstone, and a stillness to her that made rooms go quiet when she entered them. Everyone had warned me about her on my very first day. Stay out of her path. Do not make eye contact. Do not ask her questions. She had ended more lives than the rest of the crew combined, and she carried that weight in a way that made people cross to the other side of a hallway just to avoid walking near her. Now she was 3 steps away from me, blood on her sleeve, a weapon in each hand, and behind her, through a ruptured hatch, I could see shapes moving in the dark, boarding troops from a ship none of us had seen coming. "Get behind me," she said, her voice flat and quick. I did not move fast enough. She grabbed my collar and pulled me sideways just as something struck the wall where I had been standing, throwing sparks across the corridor. My ears rang. My extinguisher clattered to the floor. "You are the new one," she said, not looking at me, her eyes fixed on the dark hatch ahead, the one who does not know to be afraid of me. "I heard the warnings," I managed. "I just did not expect to meet you in the middle of an invasion. Then you are learning at a bad time." She pressed something cold into my hand, a sidearm, and closed my fingers around the grip. Pointed at the dark. "Do not think about it. Just point it." I had fired a weapon exactly twice in training, and both times my hands had shaken so badly, the instructor laughed. My hands were shaking now too, but there was no laughing in this corridor. There was only smoke, and the sound of boots on metal, and Vesa Ilan standing beside me, like she had already decided I was not going to die tonight, whether I agreed with that plan or not. The first shape came through the hatch fast, a boarding trooper in dark armor, and Vesa moved before I could even register the threat, closing the distance in 2 strides and putting the trooper down without wasted motion. A second one followed. She handled that one just as quickly, her movements economical, almost quiet, like violence to her was simply another kind of stillness. A third trooper came through, firing blind into the smoke, and that shot went wide of her and close to me, close enough that I felt the heat of it pass my shoulder. I fired back without thinking, the way she told me to, not aiming so much as flinching the trigger toward the muzzle flash, and the trooper folded. My whole body went cold and hot at the same time. I had never done that before. I did not know what to feel about it yet, and there was no time to figure it out, because more boots were coming. "Move," Vesa said, already walking, not running, toward the hatch. "There will be more behind these. We close this breach, or the whole deck goes." I followed her because I did not know what else to do, and because some part of me that was younger than I wanted to admit, trusted that she would not let me die standing next to her. We reached the breach control panel bolted beside the ruptured hatch. The casing was scorched, half its lights dead. Vesa knelt and started working the manual release, her fingers moving fast over controls that meant nothing to me. "Hold the corridor," she said, without turning around. "Anything comes through that is not me, you shoot it." I have fired a gun exactly 3 times in my life, twice of those were tonight. "Then you are due for a 4th. I stood over her with the sidearm raised, watching the dark hatch, listening to my own heartbeat hammer louder than the alarms. Something moved in the smoke. I fired before I could think about it, and something fell. "Good," she said simply, not looking up, still working the panel. The compliment landed strange in my chest, warm somehow, in the middle of all that fear. I had spent a week being told this woman was a weapon shaped like a person, and here she was, kneeling in the wreckage of my ship, keeping me alive with short instructions and a steadiness that made the chaos around us feel almost survivable. The panel sparked and the hatch groaned, metal folding inward as the emergency seal began to close. Vesa stood, wiped a line of blood from her jaw with the back of her hand, and looked past me down the corridor. "There is a second breach point," she said. "Deck 6, near the reactor corridor. If they take that, this ship stops being a ship." "How do you know that?" "Because it is where I would attack, if I were them." She started walking. "Come. I would rather keep you where I can see you than leave you here to find more trouble." I followed her through corridors lit only by emergency strips, past crew running the other direction, past a medic working over someone on the floor who I made myself not look at too long. Vesa moved through all of it like weather moves through a landscape, unhurried, absolute, and I stayed close behind her because staying close to her felt, strangely, like the safest place on the entire ship. "Why does everyone fear you?" I asked her, somewhere in that run, the question coming out before I decided to ask it. "Because I have done things that deserve fear," she answered, not slowing down. "I do not ask them to feel otherwise. You just saved my life twice in 10 minutes. That does not undo the rest of it." I did not have an answer for that, and there was no time to find one, because Deck 6 opened in front of us in chaos, sparks raining from a ruptured conduit, 3 crew members pinned behind an overturned cargo rack, firing at shapes moving beyond a second breached hatch. Vesa did not slow down. She moved into that chaos, like it was simply the next room in a house she already knew, calling instructions to the pinned crew in a voice that cut clean through the noise, telling them where to aim, when to move, when to hold. I stayed at her side, firing when she told me to fire, ducking when she told me to duck, my whole body running on something other than thought. One of the pinned crew members was a young woman named Ellen Marsh, barely older than me, blood running from a cut above her eyebrow, her hands steady on her weapon even though her voice shook when she called out ammunition counts. Beside her crouched an older man named Owen Price, a deck engineer by his uniform patches, gripping a wrench like it might somehow help against armed troopers, because the alarm had caught him with nothing else in reach. "Elon," Owen shouted over the noise, "the reactor conduit feed is exposed. If that takes one more hit, we lose containment on this whole deck." "Then we do not let it take one more hit," Vesa answered, and moved. I watched her cross open ground under fire, drawing 3 shots away from where Ellen and Owen were pinned, closing on the breached hatch with a speed that did not look human, though of course it was not, and did not look entirely like anything I had a name for either. She put down 2 troopers in the time it took me to draw one more breath, and turned to pull a third away from the exposed conduit before his falling body could strike it. The corridor went quiet, just the hiss of a damaged pipe and the ringing in my ears. "Clear," she called out, and Owen Price let out a breath so relieved it was almost a laugh, and Ellen Marsh sat down hard against the cargo rack like her legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold her. "You are hit," I said, noticing for the first time the dark line spreading along Vesa's side, just below her ribs, where her uniform had torn. "I am aware. You should sit down. There is still a ship to secure. There is still a ship because you have been keeping it in one piece for the last 20 minutes, I said, surprising myself with how firm my own voice came out. "Sit down for 10 seconds. I will watch the hatch." She looked at me then, really looked, the way she had not quite done back in the smoke, like she was recalculating something about me. For a moment, I thought she would simply walk past the suggestion the way she had walked past every other piece of advice offered to her since I had known her, which was, admittedly, less than an hour. Instead, she sat, back against the cargo rack, and let Owen Price wrap a strip of cloth around her side, while I stood watch over the hatch, with a weapon I still barely knew how to hold. "You did not run," she said quietly, while Owen worked. "When the alarms sounded, most of the new ones run for the pods. I did not know where the pods were. That is not the same as courage." "No," I agreed. "It really is not. I think I just did not want to be the one person who did nothing while the ship came apart." She studied me for a moment longer, and something in her expression eased, just slightly, the stillness in her shifting into something less like a blade held ready, and more like a person simply resting. "They told you to stay away from me," she said. It was not a question. "They told me a lot of things, that you had ended more lives than the rest of the crew combined, that I should not look at you twice, that sitting near you was asking for trouble. And yet here you are, standing over me with a gun you barely know how to use, because I asked you to. You asked me to hold a hatch. I am not entirely sure how I ended up doing the rest of it." That earned something close to a laugh from her, low and short, more breath than sound, but real. Ellen Marsh glanced over at us with an expression somewhere between disbelief and relief, like she could not decide which detail to be more amazed by, the fact that we were being shot at an hour ago, or the fact that Vesa Ilan was laughing. The all clear came over the intercom 20 minutes later, a tired voice announcing that the boarding party had been repelled, the breaches sealed, casualties being moved to medical, and that all crew should report for headcount at their nearest muster station. Vesa stood without help, waving off Owen Price's offered arm, and looked down the corridor toward the muster point, with the same flat stillness she had carried since the moment I first saw her. "You did well tonight," she said to me, before we parted ways. "For someone who did not know where the shelter pods were." "You did better," I said. "For someone everyone warned me to stay away from. They were not wrong to warn you. Maybe not. But I think they left out the part where you would keep me alive twice in the same hour." She did not answer that right away. She simply looked at me for a long moment, the corridor quiet around us, the smoke starting to clear, and then she said something I did not expect. "Sit with me at mess tomorrow, if you are not afraid to." I already was not afraid. I just did not know I was supposed to be. Now you know what I am. The fear would make more sense this time. "Maybe," I said. "But I think I would still rather sit next to you than anywhere else on this ship." The following morning, the mess hall was quieter than usual, the whole crew still shaking off the previous night, plates picked at rather than eaten, conversations kept low. I walked in with my tray and saw the same corner table everyone had once told me to avoid, the same seat across from Vesa Ilan that Corporal Dane Whitmore had warned me off on my very first day, calling it an empty chair nobody in their right mind would choose. I sat down anyway, same as before, except this time, nobody in the room looked surprised. A few of them, Ellen Marsh among them, actually nodded at me, like something between us had been settled the night before, and did not need explaining anymore. "You are still not afraid of me," Vesa said, sliding a piece of bread across the table without being asked, the same as she had done the very first time I sat here, weeks earlier, when none of this had happened yet. "I have seen what you actually do with that reputation now," I said. "Turns out it mostly involves keeping people like me from getting killed. That is a very simple way of describing years of things I am not proud of. Maybe. But it is also true of last night, and last night is the part I happened to be there for." She considered that in silence, turning her cup slowly between her hands, and for a while, neither of us said anything else, content to just sit there in the noise of a mess hall, slowly returning to something like normal. Owen Price stopped by our table on his way past, clapping me once on the shoulder. "Word is getting around, you know, the rookie who stood his ground on deck 6. "The word should really be about her," I said. I just stood where she told me to stand. "Word has plenty to say about her too," Owen said, glancing at Vesa with something that had not been there a week ago, something closer to respect than fear. Different kind of word than before, though. He moved on to his own table, and Ellen Marsh gave me a small wave from across the room, before turning back to her own meal, the cut above her eyebrow now closed with a neat strip of medical tape. "They are still afraid of me," Vesa said quietly, once we were alone again. "That has not changed in one night." "No," I agreed, "but I think some of them are starting to be afraid of the right things now, instead of the wrong ones. There is a difference between fearing what you have done and fearing who you are." She looked at me for a long moment, the pale gold of her eyes catching the mess hall light, and something in her expression settled, quiet and certain, the way stillness settles over a room after a storm has finally passed through it. "You still should not have sat here on your first day," she said. "Everyone was right to warn you." "Maybe," I said, picking up the bread she had given me. but I am glad I did not listen. Outside the mess hall windows, the stars moved past slow and steady, the ship carrying us onward through the dark, patched and scarred but still whole, and I sat there beside the woman everyone had warned me to avoid, eating a quiet breakfast, like the two of us had simply always belonged at that table, together, exactly like this.